Blackwell Unmasked. To save her family, Lady Isabel of Evermere was sent to wed Lord Tristan de Vere, a man known as the Ice Wolf for his ruthless nature. She expected cold indifference, but when he lifted her veil, she saw something else, something unreadable. He traced a finger along her jaw, voice low. "Do not mistake silence for cruelty, my lady," he murmured. "You may yet learn the difference." Chapter 1. The Bargain of Evermere. The parchment crackled in Lady Isabel's trembling hands, the ink of the royal decree stark against the pale vellum. Each word, penned with the king's own seal, felt like a brand against her heart. Marriage. To Lord Tristan de Vere, the Ice Wolf of Ravenska. A man whispered about in hushed tones, a lord whose lands bordered the wild, untamed north, a warrior whose reputation was as cold and unforgiving as the blizzards that swept his domain. To save Evermere, her ancestral home, from the grasping hands of Lord Ashworth, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his ambition, this was the price. Her family's survival, her people's safety, all balanced on the edge of this single, devastating decree. Isabel lowered the parchment, her gaze drifting to the window of her chamber. The late autumn sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills of Evermere, the familiar landscape a bittersweet ache in her chest. The fields, once golden with harvest, were now turning brown, the trees shedding their leaves like tears. Winter was coming, not just to the land, but to her soul. She was 23, past the age most noble women were wed, having fiercely guarded her independence, hoping, perhaps foolishly, for a match born of affection, if not love. That hope was now as withered as the last rose in the castle garden. Her father, Lord Edmund, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond his years, entered the room, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by a somber gravity. He had aged considerably in the last few months, the threat of Ashworth's claim looming over Evermere like a storm cloud. Ashworth had long coveted their lands, their strategic position, their ancient lineage. He had even, before the king's intervention, proposed a match between Isabel and his brutish son, a prospect that had filled her with a dread so profound it had stolen her sleep. This marriage, to the formidable Lord de Vere, was a lesser evil, perhaps, but an evil nonetheless. "Isabel," her father began, his voice thick with unshed emotion. He crossed the room, his hand reaching out to rest on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort that felt more like a farewell. "The king has granted us a reprieve. De Vere is a powerful ally, his lands vast, his men loyal. Ashworth will not dare move against us with Ravenska at our back." "But at what cost, father?" Isabel asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I am to be traded like a prize mare, sent to a man known for his coldness. A man they call the Ice Wolf." Lord Edmund sighed, his gaze softening with a paternal love that had always been her anchor. "He is a man of honor, Isabel. That much I have gleaned from the king's advisers. He is a warrior, hardened by the constant threat of the northern tribes, but he is also a just ruler. He will protect you. He will protect Evermere." Protect. The word echoed hollowly in the vast chamber. She did not want protection, she wanted choice. She wanted the freedom to choose her own destiny, a freedom that was now being ripped away from her. But she also knew, with a chilling certainty, that her family's survival rested on her shoulders. She was the eldest, the only unmarried daughter. Her younger sisters, Elara and Maeve, were too young, their futures still fragile blossoms waiting to unfurl. It was her duty, her inescapable obligation, to accept this fate. "When must I leave?" she asked, the question a lead weight in her throat. "Within the week. A small escort will accompany you. De Vere has sent word that he awaits his bride." Her father stumbled over the word, the unfamiliar title sounding harsh and foreign in the familiar comfort of Evermere. Isabel nodded, her gaze fixed on the tapestry depicting the history of her family, a lineage stretching back centuries. Knights in shining armor, ladies in flowing gowns, battles won and lost. Now, she would be woven into that tapestry, a new thread in the ancient weave, a sacrifice made for the survival of her line. The next few days passed in a blur of preparations. Trunks were packed with her belongings, gowns of silk and velvet, jewels that had been passed down through generations, furs to ward off the northern chill. The castle staff moved with a quiet efficiency, their faces mirroring the somber mood that had settled over Evermere. There were no joyous celebrations, no festive preparations, only the heavy silence of a farewell that felt more like a funeral. Alara, her closest sister in age and spirit, clung to her, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want you to go, Isabel," she sobbed, her voice muffled against Isabel's shoulder. "Ravenska is so far, so cold." Isabel held her sister tight, stroking her hair, trying to offer a comfort she herself did not feel. "I will be all right, Alara. I am strong. I am in Evermere." She repeated the words like a mantra, a shield against the fear that gnawed at her. Maeve, the youngest, was too young to fully understand the implications of the marriage, but she sensed the sadness in the air, her usually bright eyes clouded with confusion. She offered Isabel a small, hand-stitched doll, a clumsy representation of a knight, its fabric face bearing a hopeful smile. "For protection," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Isabel took the doll, her heart aching with a love so fierce it brought tears to her eyes. She would carry it with her, a reminder of the family she was leaving behind, the family she was sacrificing herself to save. On the morning of her departure, Isabel stood at the gates of Evermere, the cold wind whipping at her cloak. The small escort of knights, their armor gleaming in the pale sunlight, waited patiently. Her father stood beside her, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "Be brave, my daughter," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Be strong. And remember, you're always in Evermere. Your home is always here, in our hearts." Isabel nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She mounted her horse, a beautiful white mare named Snowdrop, a gift from her father on her last birthday. She looked back at Evermere, at the familiar stone walls, the towering battlements, the banner bearing the Evermere crest, a silver falcon soaring against a field of blue. It was a sight she might never see again. As she rode away, the gates of Evermere closing behind her, Isabel felt a single tear freeze on her cheek. She was leaving behind everything she knew, everything she loved, to journey to a land of ice and snow, to marry a man she had never met, a man whose heart was said to be as cold as the winter wind. She was riding into the unknown, armed only with her courage, her duty, and the faint, flickering hope that she might, somehow, find a way to survive, not just physically, but emotionally, in the harsh, unforgiving north. The image of the doll, tucked safely in her saddlebag, was a small but potent comfort. It was a reminder, a simple piece of fabric craftsmanship, that there was always a flicker of warmth, even in the bleakest of landscapes. She took a deep breath to steady her and urged her horse onwards. Chapter 2. The Ice Wolf's Gaze. The journey north was a relentless assault on the senses. The rolling hills of Evermere, with their gentle slopes and familiar greenery, gradually gave way to a harsher landscape. The trees grew taller, their branches stark and skeletal against the increasingly gray sky. The wind, once a playful whisper, became a biting, relentless force, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of snow. The further they rode, the more Isabel felt a growing sense of isolation, a feeling of being swallowed by the vastness of the wilderness. The knights of her escort, hand-picked by her father for their loyalty and skill, remained stoic and silent, their faces grim beneath their helmets. They were seasoned warriors, accustomed to long journeys and harsh conditions, but even they seemed affected by the growing bleakness of the landscape. Isabel, wrapped in layers of furs, tried to maintain a facade of composure, but the cold seeped into her bones, mirroring the growing chill in her heart. She thought of Ravenska, of the man she was to marry. Lord Tristan de Vere, the Ice Wolf. The images conjured by his reputation were daunting, a man of iron will, a ruthless warrior, a lord who ruled his lands with an iron fist. She tried to imagine his face, his eyes, but all she could conjure was a mask of cold indifference, a reflection of the harsh, unforgiving landscape that was to be her new home. On the 5th day of their journey, they reached the borders of Ravenska. The change was subtle, but noticeable. The trees grew even denser, forming a dark, impenetrable wall on either side of the narrow road. The air grew colder, the wind carrying a sharper bite. And then, she saw at a flicker of movement in the trees, a glint of steel in the fading light.
Halt!
The command came from Sir Gareth, the captain of her escort, his voice sharp and alert. The knights drew their swords, forming a protective circle around Isabel. From the shadows of the trees, a group of riders emerged. They were clad in dark furs and leather, their faces obscured by helmets, but there was no mistaking the sigil emblazoned on their shields, a black raven against a field of ice white. The men of Ravenska. Leading them was a man who could only be Lord Tristan de Vere. He sat astride a magnificent black warhorse, a creature as imposing and powerful as its rider. He was taller than she had imagined, his broad shoulders and powerful frame evident even beneath the layers of furs and armor. His helmet was off, revealing a face that was not what she had expected. It was not a face of cruelty, nor of cold indifference. It was a face etched with a weariness, a hardness born of battles fought and burdens carried. His hair was dark, almost black, streaked with silver at the temples, framing a face that was strikingly handsome, despite the lines of fatigue around his eyes. And those eyes, they were the color of the winter sky, a pale, piercing blue that seemed to see right through her. He rode forward, his gaze unwavering, fixing on Isabel with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He stopped a few feet from her, his horse pawing the ground, its breath forming clouds in the cold air. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the wind whistling through the trees. Isabel felt a tremor of fear, but she forced herself to meet his gaze, her chin lifted in defiance. She would not show weakness, not to this man, not to the ice wolf. He dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful, despite the weight of his armor. He approached her, his steps measured and deliberate. He stopped before her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the biting cold of the wind. He reached up, his gloved hand gently lifting the veil that covered her face. His fingers brushed against her cheek, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver down her spine. It was not a touch of coldness, but of something else, something unreadable. He studied her face, his gaze intense, searching. Isabel felt exposed, vulnerable, as if he were stripping away her defenses, layer by layer. She saw no trace of the legendary cruelty in his eyes, only a deep, unsettling intensity. He traced a finger along her jaw, his touch surprisingly gentle, his voice low, a rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. "Do not mistake silence for cruelty, my lady," he murmured. "You may yet learn the difference." The words were not a threat, but a promise? A challenge? Isabel could not decipher their meaning, but she felt a flicker of something within her, a spark of defiance, a refusal to be intimidated. She met his gaze, her own eyes reflecting the steely resolve that had carried her through the long, arduous journey. "I am not afraid of silence, my lord," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in her heart. "Nor am I afraid of you." A flicker of something surprise? Amusement? Crossed his face, a fleeting expression that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He lowered his hand, his gaze still locked on hers. "Brave words, Lady Isabel," he said, his voice still low, but with a hint of something else. "Respect? But bravery alone will not suffice in Ravenska. You will need more than courage to survive here." He turned, gesturing to his men. "Escort Lady Isabel to the castle. See that she is treated with the respect due to my bride." The word bride sounded strange, almost foreign, coming from his lips. It was a reminder of the bargain that had brought them together, the forced union that had stripped them both of their choices. As she rode towards Ravenska, the towering walls of the castle looming in the distance, Isabel could not shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. She had met the Ice Wolf, and he was not what she had expected. He was a mystery, an enigma, a man whose silence spoke volumes, whose gaze held secrets she could not yet fathom. She had expected coldness, but she had found something else, something far more complex, far more intriguing. And as the massive gates of Ravenska swung open to receive her, she knew that her life had irrevocably changed. She had crossed a threshold, entered a world where survival would depend not just on her courage, but on her ability to unravel the secrets of the man she was now bound to, the man whose gaze had both chilled and ignited something deep within her soul. She took a breath of frigid air and entered the castle. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Northwind. Ravenska was a fortress, a monument to strength and resilience, built to withstand the harshest winters and the most determined enemies. Its walls were thick, its towers tall, its battlements bristling with defenses. It was a place of stone and iron, of cold winds and echoing corridors. It was a far cry from the warm, welcoming embrace of Evermere. Isabel was led through a maze of hallways, her footsteps echoing on the stone floors. The air was cold, despite the torches that flickered on the walls, casting long, dancing shadows. She saw few people, only the occasional servant or guard, their faces impassive, their eyes averted. It was a place of silence, of secrets, of unspoken tensions. She was shown to her chambers, a large, sparsely furnished room with a high, vaulted ceiling. A fire crackled in the hearth, offering a meager amount of warmth against the pervasive chill. The windows were narrow, offering a glimpse of the snow-covered courtyard below and the dark, foreboding forest beyond. It was a room fit for a queen, perhaps, but it felt more like a prison. A young woman, her face pale and her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity, entered the room. She curtsied low, her movements hesitant. "My lady," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I am Alara. I have been assigned to be your maid." Isabel recognized the name. It was the same as her sister. It was a northern name and, as such, initially alien to her ears. She offered the girl a small, reassuring smile. "Alara, it is a pleasure to meet you." The girl seemed surprised by the warmth in Isabel's voice, her eyes widening slightly. She remained hesitant, however, her gaze darting around the room as if she expected to be reprimanded for some unseen transgression. Isabel gestured to a chair near the fire. "Please sit. Tell me about Ravenska." Alara hesitated for a moment, then, with a nervous glance at the door, she perched on the edge of the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She spoke in a low voice, her words punctuated by long pauses, as if she were afraid of being overheard. "It is a cold place, my lady," she began. "Lord Tristan, he is a hard man, but a just one. He protects his people. He has to. The North is dangerous." Isabel listened intently, trying to glean as much information as she could from the girl's hesitant words. She learned that Lord Tristan had lost his wife several years ago, a tragedy that had left him even more withdrawn and solitary. He had no children, no heir. The people of Ravenska respected him, feared him, but they did not love him. He was a distant figure, a lord who ruled from the shadows, a warrior who kept his own counsel. "And the whispers?" Isabel asked, her voice low. "What are the whispers about?" Alara's eyes widened, her face paling even further. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "There are stories of a curse, of a betrayal, of a lost love. They say that Ravenska is haunted, that the spirits of the dead walk these halls." Isabel felt a shiver run down her spine, despite her skepticism. She was a woman of reason, not of superstition, but the atmosphere of Ravenska, the silence, the cold, the sense of unspoken secrets, made it difficult to dismiss the girl's words entirely. As the days passed, Isabel began to explore Ravenska, her movements restricted, her interactions limited. She met with Lord Tristan only briefly, at meals, which were formal and silent affairs. He was always polite, always courteous, but there was a distance between them, a wall of ice that she could not penetrate. He spoke little, his gaze often distant, as if he were lost in his own thoughts. He answered her questions directly, but offered no further information, no warmth, no connection. He was a closed book, a locked fortress, a man who seemed determined to keep her at arm's length. He was the very definition of inscrutable. She spent her days wandering the castle, exploring its vast library, its deserted chapel, its echoing corridors. She found solace in the solitude, in the quiet moments when she could escape the watchful eyes of the servants and the guards. She wrote letters to her family, pouring out her fears and anxieties, her longing for home, her confusion about the man she had married. She also began to learn more about the north, about the constant threat of the wild tribes that roamed beyond the borders of Ravenska. She learned about the harsh winters, the long nights, the constant struggle for survival. She began to understand, perhaps, why Lord Tristan was the way he was, why he was so guarded, so distant, so cold. One evening, as she was walking along the battlements, the wind whipping at her cloak, she heard a low, mournful howl that seemed to echo through the very stones of the castle. She stopped, her heart pounding in her chest. It was the sound of a wolf, a sound that was both chilling and strangely beautiful. She looked out over the snow-covered landscape, her gaze searching the darkness. And then she saw him, Lord Tristan, standing alone on a distant tower, his silhouette stark against the pale moonlight. He was looking out over his lands, his face turned towards the north, his body rigid, his posture one of what? Grief? Loneliness? Despair? As she watched him, she felt a flicker of something within her, a spark of empathy, a sense of understanding. She saw not the ice wolf, the ruthless warrior, but a man burdened by his responsibilities, haunted by his past, isolated by his own walls of ice. She saw a man who was, perhaps, as lonely and as lost as she was. And in that moment, she realized that she was not just a prisoner of Ravenska, but a prisoner of her own expectations, her own preconceived notions. She had come to this place expecting coldness, and she had found it. But she had also found something else, something more complex, something more human. And as the wolf's howl echoed again through the night, Isabel felt a shift within her, a subtle thawing of the ice that had begun to encase her own heart. She sensed that getting to know the real Tristan, not just the legend, would be a battle in and of itself. Chapter 4. The Shadow of Ravenska. The days bled into weeks, marked by a monotonous routine that both soothed and suffocated Isabel. The vastness of Ravenska, initially intimidating, became a strange comfort. She found solace in the quiet corners of the castle, in the dusty library filled with ancient tomes, in the small, neglected chapel where flickering candles cast long shadows on the stone walls. She spent hours reading, losing herself in tales of chivalry and romance, a stark contrast to the reality of her own life. She had attempted, on several occasions, to engage Lord Tristan in conversation beyond the perfunctory exchanges at meals. She had asked him about his lands, his people, his history. He had answered her questions politely, but briefly, offering no further insight into his thoughts or feelings. He remained an enigma, a man shrouded in silence, a lord who ruled his lands with an iron fist and a closed heart. He remained an ice wolf. One afternoon, while exploring a previously undiscovered wing of the castle, Isabel stumbled upon a portrait gallery. The walls were lined with paintings of De Vere ancestors, their faces stern and imposing, their eyes following her as she walked. She studied their faces, searching for a resemblance to Lord Tristan, a clue to his character, his past. At the end of the gallery, she found a portrait that made her stop in her tracks. It was a painting of a woman, a beautiful woman with dark hair and striking blue eyes, the same eyes as Lord Tristan. She was wearing a gown of deep blue, a silver raven pendant resting on her breast. There was a sadness in her eyes, a hint of vulnerability that resonated with Isabel. Beneath the portrait, a small brass plaque identified the woman as Lady Lyra de Vere, wife of Lord Tristan. The dates of her birth and death were inscribed beneath her name. She had died 5 years ago, at the young age of 25. Isabel felt a pang of sympathy for Lord Tristan, a sudden understanding of the grief that he carried, the loss that had shaped him. She wondered about the circumstances of Lady Lyra's death, about the love that had been lost, the future that had been shattered. As she stood there, lost in thought, she heard a sound behind her. She turned to see Lord Tristan standing in the doorway, his face a mask of shadows. "She was beautiful," Isabel said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Lord Tristan did not reply. He walked towards her, his steps silent on the stone floor. He stopped beside her, his gaze fixed on the portrait. "She was everything," he said, his voice low and thick with emotion. It was the first time Isabel had heard him speak with such raw, unguarded feeling. "What happened to her?" Isabel asked gently, her voice full of compassion. Lord Tristan hesitated for a moment, his jaw tightening. "She was taken by the sickness. The wasting sickness." Isabel knew the sickness he spoke of. It was a disease that swept through the land periodically, leaving death and devastation in its wake. She had seen its effects in Evermere, the empty houses, the grieving families. "I am sorry," she said, her voice sincere. "I know what it is to lose someone you love." She thought of her mother, who had died when Isabel was a child, a loss that had left a permanent scar on her heart. Lord Tristan turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "Do you?" he asked, his voice skeptical. Isabel met his gaze, her own eyes reflecting the pain of her past. "Yes," she replied. "I lost my mother when I was young. I know the emptiness, the grief." A flicker of something understanding crossed his face. He looked away, his gaze returning to the portrait. "Lyra was different," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She was light. She brought joy to Ravenska. And then she was gone." Isabel could hear the pain in his voice, the raw, unhealed wound of his loss. She felt a surge of empathy for him, a desire to offer him comfort, to ease his burden. "It takes time," she said softly. "The grief, it never truly goes away, but it changes. It becomes bearable." Lord Tristan looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something else. Something that looked like hope. "You speak from experience," he said, his voice no longer skeptical, but curious. "Isabel nodded. "Yes," she replied. "Time and finding something to live for. Something to fight for." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense, searching. "And what do you fight for, Lady Isabel?" he asked, his voice low. Isabel met his gaze, her own eyes reflecting her determination, her resilience. "I fight for my family," she replied. "For my home. For a future that is not dictated by others." A flicker of admiration crossed his face, a fleeting expression that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He turned away, his gaze returning to the portrait of his lost wife. "The past cannot be changed," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But the future is still unwritten." He turned and walked away, leaving Isabel alone in the gallery, surrounded by the shadows of the past. As she watched him go, she realized that she had glimpsed a crack in the Ice Wolf's armor, a glimpse of the man beneath the cold exterior. She had seen his pain, his vulnerability, his humanity, and she knew that her journey in Ravenska was far from over. She had begun to unravel the mystery of Lord Tristan de Vere, but she had also discovered a new mystery, the mystery of her own heart, and the growing, unsettling feeling that she was beginning to care for the man she had been forced to marry, the man whose past was as shrouded in shadows as the castle that was now her home. She decided, right then and there, that she would be a force for change. For him, and for herself. Chapter 5. A Falcon's Flight. Spring arrived slowly in Ravenska, a hesitant unfolding of life amidst the lingering grip of winter. Patches of snow remained in the shadowed corners of the courtyard, but the days were growing longer, the sun a little warmer, the wind a little less biting. Isabel found herself drawn to the outdoors, to the vast, untamed wilderness that surrounded the castle. One morning, she discovered a small, neglected garden tucked away behind the stables. It was overgrown with weeds, the flower beds choked with thorns, but she saw the potential beneath the neglect, the promise of beauty waiting to be awakened. She began to spend her days there, clearing away the weeds, pruning the overgrown bushes, planting seeds that she had brought with her from Evermere. It was hard work, her hands often blistered and sore, but it was also therapeutic. It gave her a sense of purpose, a connection to the earth, a reminder of the life and growth that was possible even in the harshest of environments. It was a way to, quite literally, put down roots. One afternoon, as she was working in the garden, she heard a sound above her, a sharp, piercing cry. She looked up to see a falcon circling overhead, its wings spread wide against the blue sky. It was a magnificent creature, its feathers a mix of brown and white, its eyes sharp and alert. Isabel watched the falcon, fascinated by its grace and power. She had always loved birds, their freedom, their ability to soar above the earth, to see the world from a different perspective. She had often wished that she could have such freedom, such escape from the constraints of her life. As she watched, the falcon suddenly swooped down, landing on a nearby fence post. It perched there, its gaze fixed on Isabel, as if it were studying her, assessing her. Isabel held her breath, afraid to move, afraid to break the spell. She felt a strange connection to the bird, a sense of kinship, a shared understanding of the longing for freedom. "You are beautiful," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The falcon tilted its head, as if it were listening to her. Then, with a sudden movement, it spread its wings and took flight, soaring back into the sky, disappearing into the vastness of the wilderness. Isabel watched it go, a feeling of longing in her heart. She wished she could follow it, escape the confines of Ravenska, fly away to a place where she could be free. But she knew that was not possible. She had made a commitment, a sacrifice. She was the Lady of Ravenska, bound to this place, to this man. She had a duty, a responsibility. But the falcon's flight had awakened something within her, a renewed sense of hope, a determination to find her own kind of freedom, even within the walls of Ravenska. She would not be a prisoner, not in her heart, not in her spirit. She would find a way to soar, to create her own path, to make her own mark on this place. She returned to her work in the garden, her hands moving with a renewed energy, her heart filled with a newfound resolve. She would bring beauty back to this neglected corner of Ravenska, just as she would bring warmth and light back into the life of the man she had married. She would be a force for change, a catalyst for growth, a beacon of hope in the darkness. As she worked, she noticed a figure watching her from the shadows of the stables. It was Lord Tristan, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on her. She met his gaze, her chin lifted in defiance, her eyes reflecting her determination. He approached her slowly, his steps silent on the soft earth. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze sweeping over the garden, taking in the changes she had made. "You have been busy," he said, his voice neutral. "I find solace in the earth," Isabel replied, her voice steady. "In creating beauty." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "You remind me of her," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. Isabel knew he was referring to Lady Lyra. She felt a pang of jealousy, a flicker of resentment, but she pushed it aside. She would not compete with a ghost, with a memory. "I am not her," she said, her voice firm. "I am Isabel." He nodded slowly, his gaze still locked on hers. "Yes," he said. "You are Isabel." He reached out, his hand brushing against a stray lock of her hair that had escaped from her braid. It was a fleeting touch, a seemingly insignificant gesture, but it sent a shiver down her spine. It was the first time he had touched her willingly, without the formality of a greeting or a farewell. He withdrew his hand, his face once again a mask of shadows. "Do not expect too much," he said, his voice low and warning. "Ravenska is not Evermere. It is a place of shadows, of loss." "I know," Isabel replied, her voice unwavering. "But even in the shadows, there can be light. Even in loss, there can be hope." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense, searching. Then, with a sigh, he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the darkness of the stables. Isabel watched him go, her heart filled with a mixture of emotions: hope, fear, determination, and a growing, undeniable sense of attraction. She knew that the path ahead would be difficult, that the shadows of Ravenska were deep and pervasive. But she also knew that she was not alone. She had the falcon spirit within her, the strength to soar, the courage to face the darkness, and the hope to find her own kind of freedom, even in the heart of the Ice Wolf's domain. She gently touched the place where his hand had brushed her hair, a small smile forming. Chapter 6. The Frozen Hearth. The tentative thaw in Ravenska's atmosphere, spurred by Isabel's quiet efforts, extended to the castle's inhabitants. Servants, initially wary and distant, began to offer hesitant smiles. Alara, her maid, lost some of her timidity, sharing stories of her family and the local village, her voice no longer a constant whisper. Even the stoic guards seemed to soften their expressions when Isabel passed, their nods of respect tinged with a hint of warmth. Lord Tristan, however, remained an enigma. He observed Isabel's interactions, her growing influence on the castle's atmosphere, with a mixture of curiosity and something else. Something that Isabel couldn't quite decipher. He remained polite, courteous, but distant, the wall of ice around his heart seemingly impenetrable. Their conversations remained brief, formal, centered around the necessary details of managing the estate. He never initiated personal conversation, never asked about her feelings, her hopes, her fears. One evening, after a particularly long and silent meal, Isabel decided to take a risk. She had noticed that Lord Tristan often retreated to the library after dinner, spending hours alone amongst the ancient tomes. She decided to join him, hoping to find a way to break through his defenses, to reach the man beneath the icy exterior. She found him sitting in a large armchair by the fire, a book open in his lap, but his gaze was distant, lost in the flames. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "My lord," Isabel said softly, her voice hesitant. "May I join you?" He gestured to a chair opposite him, his movements stiff and formal. "As you wish, my lady." Isabel sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, broken only by the crackling of the fire. She searched for a way to begin, a topic that might spark a conversation, a connection. "I have been reading about the history of Ravenska," she said, her voice breaking the silence. "It is a fascinating and tragic history." He looked at her, his eyes flickering with a hint of something. "Interest? Curiosity?" "It is a history of survival," he said, his voice low. "Of enduring hardship. Of loss."
Isabel nodded.
"And of loyalty," she added. "The de Veras have always been loyal to the crown, to their people." He studied her for a moment, his gaze intense. "Loyalty is a heavy burden," he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "It demands sacrifice." Isabel sensed an opening, a glimpse beneath the surface. "And what sacrifices have you made, my lord?" she asked gently, her voice full of compassion. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. He looked away, his gaze returning to the fire. "Too many," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Isabel waited, her heart aching for him. She knew he was referring to the loss of his wife, to the burdens of his responsibilities, to the isolation he had imposed upon himself. "You do not have to carry those burdens alone," she said softly. "I am your wife. I am here to share them." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and doubt. "You are a stranger," he said, his voice cold. Isabel felt a pang of hurt, but she refused to be deterred. "We may have been strangers when we wed," she replied, "but we do not have to remain strangers. We can get to know each other. We can build a connection." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering.
"Why?"
he asked, his voice skeptical. "Why would you want to connect with me? I am the Ice Wolf. I am cold. I am broken." Isabel met his gaze, her own eyes reflecting her sincerity, her compassion. "Because I see beneath the surface," she replied. "I see the pain. I see the loneliness. I see the man you try to hide." A flicker of something vulnerability crossed his face, a fleeting expression that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He looked away, his gaze once again fixed on the fire. "Do not expect too much," Lady Isabel, he said, his voice low and warning. I am not capable of love. Not anymore. Isabel felt a chill run down her spine, but she refused to give up hope.
Perhaps not, she said softly.
But perhaps you are capable of more than you think. Perhaps you just need someone to remind you. She stood up, her movements graceful and deliberate. She walked towards him, stopping just a few feet away. She reached out, her hand gently touching his cheek. It was a bold move, a gesture of intimacy that she had never dared before. He flinched at her touch, his body stiffening. But he did not pull away. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise, confusion, and something else. Something that looked like longing. Good night, my lord, Isabel said softly, her voice barely a whisper. She withdrew her hand, turned, and walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts, with his demons, with the flickering flames of the fire that mirrored the tentative thaw that had begun in his heart. She knew, as she closed the library door carefully behind her, that this was just the beginning of a longer, more subtle campaign. She would have to be patient. Chapter 7. Beneath the Armor. The following days were marked by a subtle shift in Lord Tristan's demeanor. He remained reserved, his words carefully chosen, but there was a noticeable softening in his gaze, a lessening of the icy distance that had previously separated them. He began to seek out Isabel's company, joining her in the garden, accompanying her on walks through the castle grounds, even engaging in brief conversations about topics beyond the mundane. One morning, Isabel found him in the stables, tending to his warhorse, a magnificent black stallion named Shadow. The horse was a powerful, intimidating creature, but Tristan handled it with a gentleness that surprised Isabel. He spoke to the horse in low, soothing tones, his hand stroking its neck with a tenderness that belied his reputation as the Ice Wolf. Isabel watched him from a distance, fascinated by this glimpse of a different side of him. She had seen him as a warrior, a lord, a grieving husband, but she had never seen him as a man who cared for animals, a man who possessed such gentleness. He sensed her presence and turned, his expression unreadable. He did not speak, but he did not turn away either. He simply waited, his gaze fixed on her. Isabel approached him slowly, her steps hesitant. He is beautiful, she said, her voice soft, referring to the horse. Tristan nodded. He is loyal, he said, his voice low. And strong. He has carried me through many battles. Isabel reached out, her hand tentatively touching the horse's velvety nose. Shadow nuzzled her hand, accepting her touch without hesitation. He trusts you, Isabel said, her voice filled with admiration. Tristan looked at her, his eyes flickering with a hint of something.
Frida?
Vulnerability? Trust is earned, he said, his voice thoughtful. It is not given freely. Isabel met his gaze, her own eyes reflecting her understanding. I know, she replied. And it is easily broken. He studied her for a moment, his gaze intense. You speak from experience, he said, his voice no longer a question but a statement.
Isabel Nari.
Yes, she replied. I have learned the hard way. She thought of Lord Ashworth's treachery, of the betrayal that had forced her into this marriage, of the broken trust that had shattered her illusions. Tristan looked away, his gaze returning to his horse. The world is full of betrayal, he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. It is difficult to know who to trust. Isabel sensed an opening, a chance to connect with him on a deeper level. But it is not impossible, she said softly. There are good people in the world, people who are worthy of trust. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. And are you one of those people, Lady Isabel? He asked, his voice low and challenging. Isabel met his gaze, her own eyes unwavering. I hope to be, she replied. I strive to be. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense, probing. Then, with a sigh, he turned back to his horse, his hand resuming its gentle stroking of its neck. Trust is a precious thing, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It must be guarded carefully. Once lost, it is difficult to regain. Isabel knew he was not just talking about the horse. He was talking about himself, about his own broken trust, his own guarded heart. She felt a surge of compassion for him, a desire to heal his wounds, to earn his trust, to show him that she was worthy of it. "I understand," she said softly, "and I will do my best to earn yours." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of doubt and hope. It was a fleeting expression, quickly masked, but Isabel saw it, and it gave her courage. He continued to tend to his horse, his movements slow and deliberate. Isabel watched him, her heart filled with a growing sense of connection. She was beginning to see beneath the armor, beneath the cold exterior, beneath the reputation of the ice wolf. She was beginning to see the man, the vulnerable, wounded man who hid behind his walls of ice. As she stood there, she realized that she was no longer just trying to survive in Ravenska. She was no longer just trying to fulfill her duty, to save her family. She was beginning to care. She was beginning to feel something for this man, this complex, enigmatic man who had captured her attention, her empathy, and perhaps her heart. It was a slow, gradual shift, but it was undeniable.
And it was terrifying.
He finished grooming Shadow, and for a moment, she thought he would leave. But instead, he looked at her and asked, "Would you like to ride?" It was the first question that carried more of a personal and less of a formal tone. Chapter 8. The Lady's Gambit. Isabel's surprise at Tristan's unexpected invitation was evident, but she quickly recovered, a small smile gracing her lips. "I would love to," she replied, her voice reflecting a genuine enthusiasm she hadn't realized she felt for riding in this new, stark landscape. Tristan gestured to a smaller, gentler mare, a chestnut-colored beauty named Willow. "She is calmer than Shadow," he said, a hint of a smile playing at the corner of his lips. It was the closest thing to a genuine smile Isabel had seen from him, and it transformed his face, making him appear younger, less burdened. He helped her mount, his hands strong and steady, his touch lingering for a moment longer than necessary on her waist. Isabel felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a warmth that had nothing to do with the weak spring sun. They rode out of the castle gates, the crisp air invigorating, the scenery breathtaking. The snow-capped mountains loomed in the distance, the dark forests stretching out before them like a vast, unexplored wilderness. Tristan led the way, his posture erect, his gaze scanning the horizon, ever watchful, ever alert. Isabel followed, her senses alive with the beauty of her surroundings. She had ridden often in Evermere, but this was different. This was wilder, freer, more exhilarating. She felt a sense of liberation, a release from the confines of the castle, the constraints of her role as Lady of Ravenska. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the rhythmic beat of the horses' hooves and the wind whistling through the trees. Isabel stole glances at Tristan, observing him, studying him. He seemed more relaxed, more at ease in the open air, away from the walls of the castle, the weight of his responsibilities. "You are a skilled rider," Isabel said, breaking the silence. Tristan glanced at her, a hint of surprise in his eyes. "As are you," he replied. "You sit your horse well." "My father taught me," Isabel said. He believed that a lady should be independent, capable. Tristan nodded. "A wise man," he said. "Independence is a valuable trait, especially in the north." Isabel sensed an opportunity to learn more about him, about his views, his beliefs. "Do you believe that women should be strong?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He studied her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "Strength takes many forms," he replied. "It is not just about physical prowess. It is about courage, resilience, intelligence, loyalty." Isabel met his gaze, her own eyes reflecting her agreement. "And do you believe that women possess those qualities?" she pressed. He smiled, a genuine smile this time, a smile that reached his eyes. "Some women," he said. "Just as some men do." Isabel felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of validation, of respect. He did not dismiss her, did not belittle her because of her gender. He saw her as an individual, as a person with her own strengths, her own capabilities. They continued to ride, their conversation flowing more easily now, their initial awkwardness dissipating. They talked about their families, their childhoods, their hopes, their fears. Isabel learned about Tristan's upbringing, his rigorous training as a warrior, his early responsibilities as the heir to Ravenska. She learned about his love for his lands, his people, his commitment to protecting them from the constant threats of the north. Tristan, in turn, learned about Isabel's sheltered upbringing, her love for learning, her passion for art and music, her fierce loyalty to her family. He learned about her fears, her anxieties, her determination to find her place in Ravenska, to make a difference in the lives of the people she was now responsible for. As they talked, Isabel felt a growing connection to Tristan, a sense of understanding, of empathy. She saw beneath the surface, beneath the cold exterior, beneath the reputation of the Ice Wolf. She saw the man, the complex, vulnerable, wounded man who hid behind his walls of ice. She was beginning to not only respect but admire him. They reached a high vantage point, overlooking a vast valley. The view was breathtaking, the snow-capped mountains towering in the distance, the dark forests stretching out below them like a sea of green. Tristan dismounted, his movements graceful and fluid. He helped Isabel dismount, his hands lingering on her waist, his gaze meeting hers. "It is beautiful," Isabel said, her voice filled with awe. Tristan nodded. "Ravenska is a land of contrasts," he said, "of beauty and harshness, of life and death, of shadows and light." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "Just like people," he added softly, his voice barely a whisper. Isabel met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a pull towards him, a magnetic force that drew her closer. She saw in his eyes a reflection of her own feelings, a mixture of longing, fear, and hope. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. It was a touch that sent shivers down her spine, a touch that spoke volumes, a touch that shattered the last remnants of the icy barrier between them. He had initiated a tender gesture, and it spoke more than any words. "Isabel," he murmured, her name a breath on his lips. Before either could make the next move, a shout pierced the quiet. A rider was approaching, fast, one of Tristan's men. The urgency in his posture told them both that something was terribly wrong. Chapter 9. Scars of the Past. The rider, a young scout named Ewan, reined in his horse sharply, dust and snow swirling around him. He was breathless, his face pale and streaked with grime. "My lord," he gasped, his voice tight with urgency. "Lord Ashworth, he has crossed the border. He has attacked the village of Oakhaven." The words hit Isabel like a physical blow. Ashworth, her family's ancient enemy, the man who had driven her to this marriage, the man whose cruelty was legendary. He had dared to attack Ravenska, to violate the peace, to threaten her new home. Tristan's face hardened, his eyes turning to ice. The tender moment between them was shattered, replaced by the cold reality of war, of betrayal, of duty. The Ice Wolf was back, his emotions masked, his focus sharp and unwavering.
"How many men?"
Tristan asked, his voice curt and commanding. "At least 50, my lord," Ewan replied. "Heavily armed. They burned the village. There are casualties." Isabel felt a surge of anger, of fear, of protectiveness. She thought of the villagers, the innocent people who had been caught in the crossfire of Ashworth's ambition. She thought of Alara, her maid, whose family lived in Oakhaven. "We must go," Isabel said, her voice firm, her eyes flashing with determination. "We must protect our people." Tristan looked at her, his expression surprised. He had not expected her to react with such strength. He had expected fear, perhaps, or pleas for him to protect her. But he had not expected this fierceness. "It is dangerous," he said, his voice warning. "I am not afraid," Isabel replied, her voice unwavering. "I am the Lady of Ravenska. I have a duty to my people." He studied her for a moment, his gaze intense, searching. He saw in her eyes a reflection of his own resolve, his own commitment to duty, his own willingness to fight for what he believed in. He nodded, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "Then we ride," he said, his voice firm. They mounted their horses, their movements swift and efficient. Tristan gave orders to Ewan, sending him back to the castle to gather more men. Then, with a nod to Isabel, he spurred Shadow forward, leading the way towards Oakhaven. The ride was fast and brutal, the horses' hooves pounding the frozen ground, the wind whipping at their faces. Isabel kept pace with Tristan, her body aching, her heart pounding, but her determination unwavering. They reached Oakhaven as the sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows over the devastated village. The scene that greeted them was horrific. Houses had been burned to the ground, their charred remains smoldering in the twilight. The bodies of villagers lay scattered amongst the wreckage, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and pain. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and death. Isabel felt a wave of nausea, of grief, of rage. She had never seen such devastation, such cruelty. She had read about war, about battles, but she had never witnessed it firsthand. The reality was far more brutal, far more heartbreaking than she could have ever imagined. Tristan dismounted, his face a mask of controlled fury. He moved amongst the wreckage, his eyes searching for survivors, his voice offering words of comfort and reassurance. Isabel dismounted as well, her legs trembling, her stomach churning. She forced herself to move, to help, to do something. She found Alara huddled amongst a small group of survivors, her face tear-streaked, her eyes wide with fear. "Alara!" Isabel cried, rushing to her side. "Are you all right? Your family?" Alara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. My father, he is dead," she sobbed. "My brother, he is injured." Isabel embraced her, holding her tight, offering what comfort she could. She felt a surge of guilt, of responsibility. This was her fault. Ashworth's attack was a direct result of her marriage to Tristan, of the alliance between Evermere and Ravenska. Tristan approached them, his face grim. "We must get the survivors to the castle," he said. "It is not safe here." He gave orders to his men, organizing the evacuation of the village. He worked tirelessly, efficiently, his movements precise and purposeful. He was a leader, a warrior, a protector. As Isabel watched him, she felt a renewed sense of admiration, of respect, of love. She had seen his vulnerability, his tenderness, but now she saw his strength, his courage, his unwavering commitment to his people. She also saw something else. She saw the scars, the physical scars that crisscrossed his back, revealed as he removed his heavy fur cloak to help tend to a wounded villager. They were old scars, faded but still visible, reminders of past battles, past wounds, past pain. They were a testament to his resilience, his survival, his strength. But they were also a reminder of the price he had paid, the sacrifices he had made, the burdens he carried. They were a map of his past, a story etched onto his skin, a story that Isabel was only beginning to understand. And, as she tended to the survivors alongside him, a sense of shared purpose and shared grief tightened the bond between them that had begun to forge out on the ride. This, she knew, would be a defining moment. For all of them. Chapter 10. A Dance of Deception. The return to Ravenska was somber. The injured were tended to in the castle's great hall, transformed into a makeshift infirmary. The air was thick with the scent of herbs, blood, and fear. Isabel moved amongst the wounded, offering words of comfort, assisting the castle's healer, a gruff but capable woman named Maud. Tristan, after ensuring the castle's defenses were reinforced, joined Isabel. He watched her work, her movements efficient and compassionate, her face etched with concern. He saw the way she interacted with the villagers, her touch gentle, her voice soothing, her presence a calming influence in the midst of chaos. He was not merely a good person, she actively did good. He approached her, his voice low. "You have a gift for healing," he said, his tone surprisingly soft. Isabel looked up, her eyes meeting his. "It is little enough," she replied, her voice weary. "I wish I could do more." "You are doing more than enough," Tristan said. "You are giving them hope." He reached out, his hand gently touching her arm. It was a gesture of support, of solidarity, of connection. Isabel felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of gratitude for his presence, his strength, his understanding. "We will find Ashworth," Tristan said, his voice hardening. And he will pay for what he has done. Isabel nodded, her own anger simmering beneath the surface. She knew that Ashworth's attack was not just a violation of Ravenska's territory, but a personal attack on her family, on her marriage. The following days were filled with tension and uncertainty. Scouts were sent out to track Ashworth's movements. Messengers were dispatched to Evermere, informing Lord Edmund of the attack and requesting reinforcements. Tristan spent hours poring over maps, strategizing, preparing for war. Isabel, despite her lack of military experience, insisted on being involved in the planning. She offered insights into Ashworth's character, his weaknesses, his tactics. She surprised Tristan with her sharp intellect, her strategic thinking, her unwavering determination. One evening, as they were studying a map of the borderlands, Isabel pointed to a narrow pass, hidden amongst the mountains. Ashworth is likely to use this route, she said. It is the most direct path to Evermere, and it is easily defended. Tristan studied the map, his eyes narrowing.
You are right, he said.
It is a strategic advantage, but it is also a trap. Exactly, Isabel replied. We can use it to our advantage. We can lure him in, and then ambush him. Tristan looked at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and admiration. You have a military mind, Lady Isabel, he said.
Isabel smiled, a faint, fleeting smile.
I have learned from the best, she replied, her gaze meeting his. They continued to plan, their minds working together, their ideas intertwining. They were a team, a partnership, forged in the crucible of war. The dance of deception began, a careful choreography of moves and countermoves, of feints and traps, of strategy and cunning. But amidst the preparations for war, a different kind of dance was also taking place. A dance of emotions, of unspoken feelings, of growing attraction. Tristan found himself increasingly drawn to Isabel, to her strength, her intelligence, her compassion. He found himself seeking out her company, engaging her in conversation, sharing his thoughts, his fears, his hopes. He was beginning to trust her, to rely on her, to care for her. He was, slowly and surely, falling in love with his wife. Isabel, in turn, found herself increasingly drawn to Tristan. She saw beneath the surface, beneath the cold exterior, beneath the reputation of the ice wolf. She saw the man, the complex, vulnerable, wounded man who hid behind his walls of ice. She saw his strength, his courage, his unwavering commitment to his people. She saw his scars, both physical and emotional, and she felt a deep, abiding love for him. One evening, as they were walking along the battlements, the moon casting a pale light over the snow-covered landscape, Tristan stopped, his gaze turning to Isabel. He began, his voice hesitant, his words faltering. He had never been good with words, especially words of emotion. Isabel waited, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what he was struggling to say. She had seen it in his eyes, felt it in his touch, heard it in his silences. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her face. I care for you, Isabel, he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. More than I ever thought possible. Isabel's eyes filled with tears, tears of joy, of relief, of love. And I care for you, Tristan, she replied, her voice trembling. More than words can say. He leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss, a tentative, hesitant kiss at first, then deepening with passion, with longing, with the release of pent-up emotions. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, their love, their commitment to each other. It was a kiss that promised a future together, a future forged in the fires of war and the warmth of their growing love. It was the merging of two souls, two hearts. But in the back of Isabel's mind, the image of Ashworth and the danger he represented was a stark reminder that this newfound joy was fragile and could be snatched away. Chapter 11. The thaw begins. The kiss on the battlements marked a turning point in Isabel and Tristan's relationship. The walls of ice that had separated them, built by grief, duty, and fear, began to crumble, revealing the warmth and vulnerability that lay beneath. They were still cautious, still hesitant, their past wounds still raw, but the connection between them was undeniable, a fragile flame flickering in the darkness of Ravenska. They began to spend more time together, sharing meals, walking in the gardens, talking late into the night by the fire. They spoke of their hopes, their dreams, their fears, revealing themselves to each other layer by layer, like the slow, careful unfolding of a delicate flower. Tristan, in particular, began to open up, sharing stories of his childhood, his early training as a warrior, his love for his lands, his people. He spoke of his late wife, Lyra, with a mixture of sadness and fondness, acknowledging the pain of his loss but also celebrating the joy she had brought into his life. He was finally allowing himself to look at her memory without utter devastation. Isabel listened patiently, offering comfort, understanding, and support. She did not try to replace Lyra, to erase her memory. She knew that Lyra would always hold a special place in Tristan's heart, and she respected that. But she also knew that she was creating her own place, a different place, a place built on shared experiences, shared grief, shared hope, and a growing, undeniable love. She, in turn, shared her own stories, her own fears, her own hopes. She spoke of her family, her longing for Evermere, her determination to make a difference in Ravenska, to be more than just a pawn in a political game. She spoke of her growing feelings for Tristan, her admiration for his strength, her compassion for his vulnerability, her love for the man he was, not the legend he was perceived to be. The change in their relationship was noticed by the inhabitants of Ravenska. The servants, the guards, the villagers who had sought refuge within the castle walls, all saw the difference. They saw the way Tristan looked at Isabel, his eyes softening, his gaze lingering. They saw the way Isabel smiled at Tristan, her face radiant, her eyes sparkling. They saw the way they spoke to each other, their voices gentle, their words filled with affection and respect. Alara, Isabel's maid, was particularly delighted. She had witnessed Isabel's loneliness, her isolation, her struggles. She had also seen Tristan's coldness, his distance, his grief. She had hoped, from the beginning, that they might find happiness together, that they might heal each other's wounds. "My lady," she said one morning, as she was helping Isabel dress. "You are glowing. You look happy." Isabel blushed, a warmth spreading through her cheeks. "I am," she replied, her voice soft. "I am falling in love with my husband." Alara smiled, her eyes shining. "And he with you," she said. "Anyone can see that." Isabel felt a surge of joy, of hope, of gratitude. She had come to Ravenska expecting coldness, indifference, perhaps even cruelty. But she had found something else. She had found love, connection, a sense of belonging. She had found a home. But the threat of Ashworth still loomed, a dark cloud on the horizon. The preparations for war continued, the tension in the castle palpable. Tristan was often preoccupied, his mind focused on strategy, on defense, on protecting his people. Isabel understood, but she also worried. She worried about his safety, about the risks he would take, about the possibility of losing him. She had lost so much already. She could not bear the thought of losing him too. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire, Isabel reached out, her hand covering his. "Tristan," she said softly, "promise me you will be careful." Tristan looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and determination. "I will," he said. "I promise. I have something to live for now." He leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both passionate and tender, a kiss that spoke of love, of commitment, of hope. It was a kiss that reaffirmed their bond, their connection, their determination to face the future together, whatever it might hold. As they embraced, Isabel felt a sense of peace, of contentment, of belonging. She had found her place in Ravenska, in Tristan's heart, in his life. She was no longer just the lady of Ravenska, the Winter Lord's bride. She was Isabel, his wife, his partner, his love. And she would fight for him, for their future, for their love, with every fiber of her being. The thaw had truly begun, melting away years of sorrow. But Isabel also knew, with a chilling certainty, that the coming storm would test the strength of that newly formed bond to its absolute limits. Chapter 12. Echoes of Treachery. The messenger arrived at dawn, a rider from a small, outlying village near the border. He was exhausted, his horse lathered in sweat, his face etched with fear. He brought news that sent a chill through Ravenska, a wave of dread that washed over the castle's inhabitants. "Lord Ashworth, he has allied himself with the northern tribes," the messenger gasped, his voice hoarse. "They are marching together towards Ravenska." The northern tribes. The wild, savage warriors who roamed beyond the borders of Ravenska, a constant threat, a persistent menace. They were known for their brutality, their ferocity, their ruthlessness. An alliance between Ashworth and the tribes was a nightmare scenario, a threat that could overwhelm Ravenska's defenses, a betrayal that cut deep. Tristan's face hardened, his eyes turning to ice. He had expected treachery from Ashworth, but this was beyond anything he had anticipated. This was a betrayal not just of Ravenska, but of the entire kingdom. "How many?" Tristan asked, his voice curt and commanding. "Thousands, my lord," the messenger replied. "More than we have ever seen." Isabel felt a surge of fear, a cold dread that gripped her heart. She thought of the villagers, the refugees who had sought shelter within Ravenska's walls. She thought of Tristan, of the danger he would face, of the possibility of losing him. But she pushed her fear aside, replacing it with determination, with resolve. She would not cower. She would not be afraid. She would stand by Tristan's side, fight for Ravenska, for her people, for their love. "We must prepare," Isabel said, her voice firm, her eyes flashing with defiance. "We must defend Ravenska." Tristan looked at her, his expression surprised. He had expected her to be afraid, to be overwhelmed by the news. But he had not expected this strength, this courage. He nodded, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "We will," he said. "We will fight. We will not surrender." The castle sprang into action. The gates were reinforced, the walls manned, the weapons sharpened. The men-at-arms, bolstered by the arrival of a small contingent of soldiers from Evermere, prepared for battle. The atmosphere was tense, charged with anticipation, with fear, but also with determination. Isabel, despite her lack of military training, played a crucial role. She organized the women of the castle, assigning them tasks, ensuring that the wounded would be cared for, that the defenders would be fed, that the castle would be prepared for a siege. She moved amongst the people, offering words of comfort, of encouragement, of hope. She was a beacon of strength, a symbol of resilience, a leader. She also continued to offer Tristan her strategic insights, her knowledge of Ashworth's character, her understanding of the terrain. She was his advisor, his confidant, his partner. As they were working together in the war room, studying maps, discussing strategy, Isabel noticed something, a small detail that had escaped their attention. "Tristan," she said, pointing to a particular area on the map, a dense forest near the border. "This forest, it is unusually thick. It would be difficult to pass through." Unless Tristan looked at the map, his eyes narrowing. "Unless there is a hidden path," he said. "A path known only to the northern tribes."
Isabel nodded.
"Ashworth must have promised them something," she said. "Something valuable. In exchange for their knowledge. Their alliance." Tristan's jaw tightened. "He has betrayed us all," he said, his voice filled with anger. "He has sold his soul to the devil." They realized that Ashworth's plan was not just to attack Ravenska, but to use the northern tribes to outflank them, to attack from an unexpected direction, to overwhelm their defenses. "We must find that path," Tristan said. "We must block it. Before they reach it." He ordered a scouting party to be sent out, led by his most trusted captain, Sir Gareth. They were to search for the hidden path, to confirm its existence, to report back as quickly as possible. The wait was agonizing. Hours passed, each one stretching into an eternity. Isabel paced restlessly, her anxiety growing with each passing moment. She prayed for the safety of the scouts, for the success of their mission, for the survival of Ravenska. Finally, as dusk was beginning to fall, the scouts returned. Their faces were grim, their news dire. "We found the path, my lord," Sir Gareth reported. It is well hidden, but it is passable, and the northern tribes are already on their way. Tristan's face was a mask of cold determination. "We will meet them," he said. "We will stop them before they reach Ravenska." He gave the order, and, amidst the clanging of steel and the hushed prayers of those left behind, Tristan, Isabel, and the remaining soldiers rode out to meet the combined forces of Ashworth and the northern tribes. The echoes of treachery, however, were not confined to the battlefield. They reverberated within Isabel's heart, reminding her that trust, once broken, was a fragile thing indeed. Chapter 13. The Price of Loyalty. The clash was brutal, a maelstrom of steel and blood, of screams and war cries. Tristan led the charge, his black warhorse, Shadow, plunging into the enemy ranks, his sword a whirlwind of death. He fought with a ferocity born of desperation, of determination, of a fierce protectiveness for his people, for his land, for Isabel. Isabel, against Tristan's initial protests, rode with the rear guard, her presence a symbol of defiance, of courage, of unwavering support. She had insisted on being there, on witnessing the battle, on sharing the risk, on standing by Tristan's side, even in the face of death. She would not be left behind. She watched in horror as the battle raged, the forces of Ravenska outnumbered, outmatched by the combined might of Ashworth's men and the savage northern tribes. The fighting was fierce, relentless, the ground littered with the bodies of the fallen, the air thick with the stench of blood and death. She saw Tristan fighting, his movements graceful and deadly, his sword flashing in the fading light. He was a force of nature, a warrior born, a leader inspiring his men to fight on, even against overwhelming odds. But she also saw the danger, the constant threat that surrounded him, the enemy soldiers swarming around him, their weapons aimed at him, their hatred palpable. She feared for his life, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She saw Sir Gareth fall, his body pierced by a northern tribesman's spear. She saw other men fall, loyal soldiers of Ravenska, sacrificing their lives to defend their home, their lord, their lady. And then she saw it. Ashworth, riding towards Tristan, his face twisted with hatred, his sword raised high. He was aiming for Tristan's back, a cowardly attack, a betrayal of all that was honorable. "Tristan!" Isabel screamed, her voice lost in the din of battle. But it was too late. Ashworth's sword struck, piercing Tristan's armor, drawing blood. Tristan staggered, his horse rearing, his grip on his sword loosening. Isabel felt a surge of rage, of despair, of a fierce, protective instinct. She spurred her horse forward, drawing a small dagger she had concealed beneath her cloak, the same dagger Maeve, her little sister, had gifted her. She would not stand idly by while Tristan was attacked. She would fight. She would defend him. She would kill. She rode towards Ashworth, her heart pounding, her hand trembling, but her determination unwavering. She was no warrior, but she was a woman scorned, a wife protecting her husband, a lady defending her home. She reached Ashworth, her dagger flashing in the dim light. She struck, aiming for his exposed neck, her blow fueled by adrenaline, by rage, by love. But Ashworth saw her coming. He parried her blow, his sword knocking the dagger from her hand. He laughed, a cruel, mocking laugh. "You dare to attack me, Lady Isabel?" He sneered. "You are nothing. A pawn. A whore." He raised his sword, aiming to strike her down, to end her life, to punish her for her defiance. But before he could strike, a figure intervened. A young soldier, one of Tristan's men, threw himself in front of Isabel, taking the blow meant for her. He fell, his body crumpling to the ground, his lifeblood staining the snow. Isabel stared in horror, her eyes filled with tears. She had never intended for anyone to die for her. She had acted impulsively, foolishly, driven by emotion, not by reason. Tristan, despite his injury, had witnessed the scene. He roared with fury, a primal scream that echoed across the battlefield. He charged towards Ashworth, his sword a blur of motion, his strength renewed by his rage, by his love for Isabel, by his need to protect her. He engaged Ashworth in a fierce duel, their swords clashing, their bodies straining, their hatred palpable. Tristan, despite his wound, fought with a ferocity that Ashworth could not match. He was fueled by something more than just skill, more than just training. He was fueled by love, by loyalty, by a righteous anger that burned like a fire within him. He disarmed Ashworth, his sword knocking Ashworth's weapon from his grasp. He stood over him, his sword pointed at Ashworth's throat, his face a mask of cold fury. "You will pay for your treachery, Ashworth," Tristan said, his voice low and deadly. "You will pay for everything." But before Tristan could deliver the final blow, a horn sounded in the distance. The northern tribes, seeing their alliance crumbling, their hopes of victory fading, began to retreat, their war cries turning to screams of panic. Tristan hesitated, his gaze flickering between Ashworth and the retreating tribes. He knew that he should pursue them, that he should crush them, that he should end the threat they posed. But he also knew that he could not leave Ashworth alive, that he could not risk him escaping, that he could not let him go unpunished. Isabel, seeing his hesitation, his internal struggle, spoke, her voice clear and strong.
"Go, Tristan," she said.
"Finish it. I will deal with Ashworth." Tristan looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude, of love, of trust. He nodded, a single curt nod. Then, with a final, venomous glare at Ashworth, he turned and rode after the retreating tribes, his men following him, their spirits renewed by his leadership, by his courage, by his unwavering commitment to their protection. Isabel was left alone with Ashworth, the man who had caused her so much pain, the man who had threatened her life, her home, her love. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a cold, hard determination. The price of loyalty, she realized, was sometimes paid in blood, and she was prepared to collect. The next few moments would determine not only the fate of Ashworth, but the future of her relationship with Tristan and the future of Ravenska. Chapter 14. A Knight's Confession. Ashworth lay on the ground, disarmed and defeated, his face contorted with a mixture of fear and defiance. Isabel stood over him, her small frame belying the steely resolve in her eyes. She had no weapon, but she had something more powerful, the righteous anger of a woman wronged, the fierce protectiveness of a wife, the unwavering loyalty of a lady. "You will not kill me," Ashworth sneered, his voice trembling slightly. "You are a woman. You do not have the stomach for it." Isabel met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "You mistake me, Ashworth," she said, her voice cold and steady. "You think that because I am a woman, I am weak. You think that because I am a lady, I am incapable of violence. You are wrong." She knelt beside him, her movements deliberate, her gaze never leaving his. "I may not be a warrior," she said, "but I am a survivor. I have endured your treachery. I have endured this marriage. I have endured this war. And I will endure. You, however, will not." Ashworth's eyes widened in fear, his bravado crumbling. He saw in her eyes a determination he had not anticipated, a strength he had underestimated. He saw death. But Isabel did not kill him. She could not. Despite her anger, despite her desire for revenge, despite the pain he had caused her, she could not bring herself to take his life. She was not a murderer. She was not like him. She stood up, her gaze turning towards the battlefield, where Tristan and his men were pursuing the retreating northern tribes. She knew that she had to make a decision, a difficult decision, a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. She turned back to Ashworth, her voice firm.
"I will not kill you," she said.
"But I will not let you go free. You will be held accountable for your crimes. You will face justice." She called for the remaining Ravenska soldiers, those who had not pursued the fleeing tribes. They arrived, their faces grim, their weapons drawn. They had witnessed Ashworth's treachery, his attack on Tristan, his attempt to kill Isabel. They were ready to carry out whatever sentence she deemed fit. "Take him," Isabel ordered, her voice ringing with authority. "Bind him. He is a prisoner of Ravenska." The soldiers obeyed, roughly binding Ashworth's hands and feet, dragging him to his feet. He struggled, cursing, spitting venom, but they were unmoved. They had seen his true colors, his cowardice, his cruelty. They had no sympathy for him. As the soldiers were leading Ashworth away, Tristan returned, his face streaked with blood and sweat, his armor dented and battered, but his eyes shining with victory. The northern tribes had been routed, their alliance with Ashworth shattered, their threat to Ravenska neutralized. He saw Isabel, standing tall and proud, her gaze unwavering. He saw Ashworth, bound and defeated, surrounded by Ravenska soldiers. He understood what had happened, what she had done. He dismounted, his movements stiff and weary, but his heart filled with a surge of love and admiration for Isabel. He approached her, his gaze searching hers. "You saved my life," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. Isabel met his gaze, her eyes softening. "And you mine," she replied. "We protect each other." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, wiping away a streak of dirt and blood. "You are remarkable, Isabel," he said. "You are stronger than I ever imagined."
Isabel smiled, a faint, fleeting smile.
"And you are more vulnerable than you let on," she replied, her gaze meeting his. He nodded, a flicker of sadness in his eyes. He knew that she was referring to his wound, the injury he had sustained from Ashworth's attack. It was not a serious wound, but it was a reminder of his vulnerability, of his mortality, of the risks he had taken. He removed his gauntlet, his hand reaching for hers. He intertwined their fingers, their hands clasping together, a symbol of their bond, their connection, their love. He began, his voice hesitant, his words faltering. He had never been good with words, especially words of emotion. But he knew that he had to tell her, that he had to confess his feelings, that he had to reveal the truth that lay hidden within his heart. "I love you, Isabel," he said, his voice low and filled with a sincerity that resonated deep within her soul. "I love you more than words can say, more than life itself." Isabel's eyes filled with tears, tears of joy, of relief, of unconditional love. She had waited so long to hear those words, to know that her feelings were reciprocated, to feel the warmth of his love surrounding her. "And I love you, Tristan," she replied, her voice trembling. "With all my heart, with all my soul." He leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both passionate and tender, a kiss that sealed their love, their commitment, their future together. It was a kiss that spoke of hope, of healing, of a new beginning. It was a kiss that banished the shadows of the past, the ghosts of grief, the echoes of treachery. As they embraced, surrounded by the aftermath of battle, by the wounded and the fallen, by the evidence of their victory, they knew that their journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, obstacles to overcome, wounds to heal. But they also knew that they would face them together, united by their love, their loyalty, their unwavering commitment to each other, to Ravenska, to their future. A night's confession, spoken amidst the carnage of war, had solidified their bond, a bond forged in fire and tempered by love. The confession, coming as it did after a trial by fire, was all the sweeter. Chapter 15. The Serpent's Kiss. The victory over Ashworth and the northern tribes brought a fragile peace to Ravenska. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the wounds of war, both physical and emotional, lingered. The castle became a place of healing, of recovery, of rebuilding. Tristan, despite his own injury, oversaw the efforts to repair the damage, to assist the villagers, to restore order. He was a tireless leader, his presence a source of strength and reassurance to his people. He tended to his duties with his customary dedication. Isabel, in turn, focused on healing the emotional wounds, on comforting the grieving, on tending to the injured. She worked alongside Maud, the castle's healer, learning about herbs, about remedies, about the art of healing. She also spent time with the children, the orphans who had lost their parents in the attack, offering them comfort, companionship, and hope. Their shared experiences, their shared grief, their shared victory had brought Tristan and Isabel closer than ever before. Their love had blossomed in the midst of war, a fragile flower blooming in the harsh landscape of the north. They were inseparable, their bond unbreakable, their commitment unwavering. But the shadows of the past still lingered, the echoes of treachery still reverberated. Ashworth, imprisoned in the castle's deepest dungeon, awaited his fate. Tristan had sent word to the king, informing him of Ashworth's crimes, requesting his judgment. The wheels of royal justice turned slowly, and the wait was agonizing. One evening, as Isabel was walking through the castle corridors, she heard a voice, a faint, whispering voice, coming from the direction of the dungeons. She hesitated, her curiosity piqued. She knew that she should not go near Ashworth, that he was a dangerous man, a man capable of anything. But something drew her towards him, a sense of unfinished business, a need to confront him, to understand the depths of his hatred, the reasons for his treachery. She knew it was foolish, dangerous, but she could not resist the pull. She descended the narrow, winding stairs, the air growing colder, the darkness deeper. The only light came from a flickering torch on the wall, casting long, eerie shadows. The scent of damp stone and mildew filled her nostrils. She reached the dungeon door, a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bars. She could hear Ashworth's voice, his muttered curses, his whispered pleas. She peered through the bars, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. She saw Ashworth, chained to the wall, his face bruised and battered, his clothes torn and ragged. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "Lady Isabel," he sneered, his voice weak but still venomous. "Come to gloat? Come to witness my suffering?" Isabel met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I came to understand," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I came to ask you why." Ashworth laughed, a harsh, bitter laugh.
Why?
He repeated. "Because I deserved it. Ravenska, Evermere, your family, they stole what was rightfully mine." Isabel felt a surge of anger, of disgust. His words were filled with self-pity, with delusion, with a complete lack of remorse. "You deserve nothing," she said, her voice cold. "You are a traitor, a murderer, a coward." Ashworth's eyes narrowed, his gaze filled with hatred. "You will pay for your insolence," he hissed. "You and your ice-wolf husband. You will both suffer." He leaned closer to the bars, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I have allies," he said. "Friends in high places. They will not forget me. They will avenge me." Isabel felt a chill run down her spine, a sense of unease, of foreboding. She knew that Ashworth was a dangerous man, a man with connections, a man capable of anything. But before she could respond, she heard a sound behind her, a soft footstep, a rustle of fabric. She turned, her heart pounding in her chest. Standing in the shadows was a figure, a woman cloaked and hooded, her face hidden from view. The woman held a small vial in her hand, a vial filled with a dark, viscous liquid. "Who are you?" Isabel asked, her voice trembling. The woman did not answer. She moved swiftly, silently, her movements graceful and deadly. She reached out, her hand grabbing Isabel's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Before Isabel could react, the woman forced the vial to Isabel's lips, pouring the liquid down her throat. Isabel struggled, gasping, choking, but it was too late. The liquid burned like fire, its taste bitter and acrid. The woman released her, stepping back into the shadows. "A serpent's kiss," she whispered, her voice chillingly calm. "A slow poison. You will suffer. You will die. Just like your husband's first wife." Isabel collapsed to the floor, her body convulsing, her vision blurring, her mind racing. Poison. She had been poisoned. By Ashworth's ally, a woman hidden in the shadows, a woman who had delivered a serpent's kiss, a kiss of death. The woman disappeared, melting back into the darkness, leaving Isabel alone, dying, in the cold, damp dungeon of Ravenska. The serpent's kiss, a final act of treachery, had shattered the fragile peace, plunging Isabel into a desperate fight for her life, a fight against a hidden enemy, a fight against the shadows of the past. This would test Tristan in ways no battle ever could. Chapter 16. Flames in the Snow. The world dissolved into a swirling vortex of pain and confusion. Isabel's body burned, a fire consuming her from the inside out. Her vision blurred, her thoughts scattered, her strength ebbing away with each agonizing breath. She clutched at her throat, gasping for air, her mind screaming in silent terror. Poison. The word echoed in her mind, a death knell, a sentence of doom. She managed to crawl, inch by agonizing inch, towards the dungeon door, her fingers scrabbling at the cold stone floor. She had to get out, had to reach help, had to live. For Tristan. For Ravenska. For herself. She reached the door, her hand weakly grasping the iron bars. Help, she croaked, her voice a barely audible whisper. Please someone. Her plea was answered, not by a guard, not by a servant, but by Alara, her maid. Alara, who had been searching for her, worried by her absence, had followed her to the dungeons. Alara saw Isabel collapsed on the floor, her face pale and contorted, her body trembling. She screamed, her cry echoing through the silent corridors. "My lady!" she cried, rushing to Isabel's side. "What happened? What's wrong?" Isabel could not speak. She could only point weakly towards the shadows, towards the direction where the mysterious woman had disappeared. Alara understood. She had seen the fear in Isabel's eyes, the terror in her expression. She knew that something terrible had happened, that Isabel's life was in danger. She helped Isabel to her feet, supporting her weight, guiding her towards the stairs. "We must get you to Maud," she said, her voice urgent. "We must get help." They stumbled up the stairs, Alara's small frame struggling to support Isabel's weight. They reached the main corridor, their cries attracting the attention of guards, of servants, of Tristan. Tristan, who had been meeting with his captains, planning the next steps in the aftermath of the battle, heard the commotion. He rushed towards the sound, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind filled with a sense of dread. He saw Isabel, collapsed in Alara's arms, her face ashen, her breathing shallow, her eyes filled with pain. He knew instantly that something was terribly wrong.
Isabel,
he cried, rushing to her side. "What happened? What's wrong?" Alara explained, her voice trembling, her words tumbling over each other. "Poison, my lord." A woman in the dungeons, she gave her poison. Tristan's face turned to ice, his eyes blazing with fury. He gently took Isabel from Alara's arms, cradling her in his own, his heart breaking at the sight of her suffering.
Maud,
he roared, his voice echoing through the castle. "Get Maud.
Now."
He carried Isabel to her chambers, laying her gently on the bed. He knelt beside her, his hand stroking her hair, his eyes filled with a mixture of love, fear, and desperation. "Isabel, stay with me," he pleaded, his voice choked with emotion. "Please don't leave me. I love you, I need you." Maud arrived, her face grim, her movements swift and efficient. She examined Isabel, her experienced hands probing, her eyes assessing, her mind racing. "Poison," she confirmed, her voice grave. "A slow-acting poison, but deadly. I don't know what kind it is. I don't know if I can save her." Tristan felt a cold dread grip his heart, a fear so profound it threatened to consume him. He could not lose Isabel. He would not lose her. He had lost too much already. "You must save her, Maud," he said, his voice firm, his eyes unwavering. "You must do everything you can. I will not let her die." Maud nodded, her determination matching his. She began to work, preparing herbs, mixing potions, using all her knowledge, all her skill, to fight the poison, to save Isabel's life. Tristan stayed by Isabel's side, holding her hand, whispering words of comfort, of encouragement, of love. He prayed, a silent, desperate prayer, to any god who would listen, to spare her life, to give him another chance, to let them have their future together. The castle held its breath, waiting, hoping, praying. The flames of the torches flickered in the drafty corridors, casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls, mirroring the flames of fear and hope that burned within Tristan's heart. The snow fell silently outside, blanketing Ravenska in a shroud of white, a stark contrast to the fiery poison that coursed through Isabel's veins. The night stretched on, an eternity of agonizing suspense, of desperate hope, of unwavering love. The fate of the Lady of Ravenska, the Winter Lord's bride, hung in the balance, suspended between life and death, between hope and despair, between the flames of poison and the cold, stark reality of a snow-covered land. Chapter 17. The Unveiling of Truth. The hours crawled by, each one an eternity. Maud worked tirelessly, her brow furrowed in concentration, her hands moving with practiced skill. She administered potions, applied compresses, chanted ancient remedies, her knowledge and experience pushed to their limits. Tristan remained by Isabel's side, his unwavering presence a source of strength, a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. He held her hand, his touch gentle yet firm, his gaze never leaving her face. He whispered words of love, of encouragement, his voice hoarse with emotion, his heart heavy with fear. Isabel's condition fluctuated. There were moments of agonizing pain, when her body convulsed, her breath hitched, her eyes fluttered open, filled with a terrifying awareness of her plight. Then, there were moments of blessed oblivion, when she slipped into unconsciousness, her body still, her breathing shallow, her face pale and serene. As dawn approached, a breakthrough. Maud, after examining a sample of the residue from the vial Alara had managed to retrieve, identified the poison. Nightshade mixed with wolfsbane, she announced, her voice grim. A deadly combination, but not impossible to counter. I have an antidote, but it is rare and difficult to prepare. Hope flickered, a fragile flame in the darkness. Tristan clung to it, his desperation fueling his determination. Do it, Maud, he said, his voice firm. Whatever it takes. Save her. Maud set to work, her movements precise and swift. She gathered the rare herbs, the precious ingredients, the necessary components for the antidote. The castle kitchens became a laboratory, the air filled with the scent of strange and potent herbs. While Maud worked, Tristan remained by Isabel's side, his vigil unwavering. He spoke to her, even though she could not hear him, telling her stories of their time together, of their love, of their future. He reminded her of her strength, her courage, her resilience. He pleaded with her to fight, to hold on, to come back to him. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale light through the narrow windows of the chamber, Maud returned, holding a small vial filled with a shimmering, golden liquid. The antidote. This should work, she said, her voice hesitant, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. But it is not guaranteed. The poison has already done much damage. Tristan nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew the risks, the uncertainties, the possibility of failure. But he had to try. He had to believe. He gently lifted Isabel's head, supporting her with his arm. Maud carefully administered the antidote, drop by agonizing drop. They waited, holding their breath, their eyes fixed on Isabel's face. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth and the faint sound of Isabel's shallow breathing. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then a flicker, a twitch of her eyelids, a sigh, a gasp. Isabel's eyes opened, slowly, hesitantly. She looked around, her gaze confused, disoriented. She saw Tristan, his face etched with worry, his eyes filled with love. Tristan, she whispered, her voice weak and raspy. Isabel, you're alive, Tristan said, his voice choked with emotion, relief flooding through him, washing away the fear that had gripped his heart. Tears streamed down his face, tears of joy, of relief, of unconditional love. He leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss, a gentle, tender kiss, a kiss that spoke of life, of hope, of a second chance. Isabel slowly regained consciousness, her strength returning, her mind clearing. She remembered the attack, the poison, the woman in the shadows. She remembered the pain, the fear, the darkness. But she also remembered Tristan, his voice, his touch, his love. He had saved her. He had stayed by her side. He had brought her back from the brink of death. As Isabel recovered, the truth began to unravel. The mysterious woman, the one who had poisoned her, was identified. She was a servant, a woman who had been in Ravenska for many years, a woman who had seemed loyal, trustworthy, unremarkable. But she was also Ashworth's spy, his lover, his accomplice. She had been planted in Ravenska years ago, waiting for the opportunity to strike, to avenge Ashworth's grievances, to carry out his twisted desires. She was captured, interrogated, and she confessed everything. She revealed Ashworth's plans, his alliance with the northern tribes, his plot to overthrow Tristan, to claim Ravenska for himself. She also revealed the names of other conspirators, other allies of Ashworth, within the castle and beyond. The unveiling of the truth was a shock, a betrayal that cut deep. It revealed the extent of Ashworth's treachery, the depth of his hatred, the lengths to which he would go to achieve his goals. It also revealed the fragility of trust, the ease with which it could be broken, the constant vigilance required to guard against hidden enemies. With the conspiracy exposed, the traitors were rounded up, imprisoned, awaiting judgment. Ashworth, his plans foiled, his allies exposed, his power broken, remained in the dungeon, his fate sealed. The unveiling of the truth, however, brought not only justice, but also a deeper understanding, a greater appreciation for the loyalty and love that had endured, that had triumphed over treachery and deceit. The serpent's kiss, meant to destroy, had instead strengthened the bond between Tristan and Isabel, revealing the depth of their love, the resilience of their spirits, the unbreakable connection that had saved them both. Chapter 18. A bond forged in fire. The recovery was slow, arduous, but Isabel was strong, her will to live fueled by her love for Tristan, her commitment to Ravenska, her determination to build a future free from the shadows of the past. She spent weeks confined to her chambers, Maud tending to her needs, Tristan constantly by her side. He rarely left her, even for the most pressing matters of the estate. He read to her, talked to her, held her hand, his presence a constant source of comfort, of strength, of love. He blamed himself for what had happened, for not protecting her, for allowing Ashworth's treachery to reach so close. "It was my fault, Isabel," he said one evening, his voice filled with guilt and self-reproach. "I should have seen it coming. I should have protected you." Isabel reached out, her hand gently touching his cheek. "No, Tristan," she said, her voice firm. "It was not your fault. It was Ashworth's. And his accomplice. You could not have known." "But I should have," he insisted. "I am responsible for your safety. For the safety of everyone in Ravenska." "And you are," Isabel replied. "You are a good lord, a just ruler, a protector. But you are not omniscient. You cannot predict every betrayal. You cannot prevent every attack." She saw the pain in his eyes, the guilt that gnawed at him. She knew that he carried the weight of his responsibilities heavily, that he blamed himself for every failure, every loss, every wound inflicted upon his people. "You saved my life, Tristan," she said, her voice filled with gratitude and love. "You stayed by my side. You brought me back. That is all that matters." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the sincerity in her gaze, the unwavering love in her expression. He saw forgiveness. He leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss, a tender, gentle kiss, a kiss that spoke of healing, of reconciliation, of a renewed commitment to their love, to their future. As Isabel regained her strength, she began to take a more active role in the affairs of Ravenska. She worked alongside Tristan, advising him, supporting him, sharing the burdens of leadership. She had proven herself to be not just a lady, not just a wife, but a partner, an equal, a force to be reckoned with. She also insisted on visiting Ashworth in the dungeon, a decision that Tristan initially opposed. He feared for her safety, for her emotional well-being. He did not want her to be exposed to Ashworth's venom, his hatred, his twisted mind. But Isabel was adamant. She needed to confront him, to face her fears, to put the past behind her. She needed closure. She descended into the dungeon, accompanied by Tristan, his presence a silent reassurance, a protective shield. Ashworth was chained to the wall, his face bruised and battered, his spirit broken. He looked up as they approached, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and despair. "So, the poisoned bride lives," he sneered, his voice weak and raspy. "A pity. I had hoped to see you in your grave." Isabel met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "You failed, Ashworth," she said, her voice calm and steady. "You failed to kill me. You failed to destroy Ravenska. You failed to break our love." Ashworth laughed, a harsh, bitter laugh. "Love?" he scoffed. "You call that love? A forced marriage. A political alliance. A sham." It was a forced marriage, Isabel agreed. But it became something more. It became a true love. A bond forged in fire. A connection that you could never understand. She saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the flicker of regret. He had underestimated her, underestimated their love, underestimated the strength of their bond. "You will pay for your crimes, Ashworth," Tristan said, his voice cold and hard. "The king will decide your fate. But I assure you, it will not be pleasant." Ashworth's bravado crumbled, his defiance fading. He knew that he was defeated, that his life was forfeit, that his dreams of power and revenge had turned to ashes. Isabel and Tristan left him in the darkness, his whispered curses echoing behind them. They ascended the stairs, emerging into the light, leaving the shadows of the past behind. Their bond, forged in the crucible of war, of betrayal, of near death, was stronger than ever. They had faced their demons, confronted their fears, overcome their challenges. They had emerged victorious, their love triumphant, their future secure. The flames of the poison, meant to destroy, had instead tempered their love, making it stronger, more resilient, more enduring. The fire had purified, cleansed, and ultimately strengthened them. Chapter 19. The Siege of Hearts. The king's judgment arrived swiftly. Ashworth was to be stripped of his titles, his lands, his possessions. He was to be executed for treason, his death a public spectacle, a warning to any who would dare to betray the crown. The news brought a sense of closure, of justice, to Ravenska. The threat that had loomed over them for so long was finally extinguished. The people rejoiced, their fear replaced by relief, their uncertainty by hope. But for Isabel and Tristan, the victory was bittersweet. The scars of the past, both physical and emotional, remained. The memories of the battle, of the poisoning, of Ashworth's treachery, lingered in their minds, casting a shadow over their newfound peace. They knew that they needed time to heal, to rebuild, to fully embrace their future together. They needed to reaffirm their love, to strengthen their bond, to create a new foundation for their marriage, a foundation built on trust, on understanding, on shared experiences. Tristan, in particular, struggled with the aftermath of the events. He felt responsible for Isabel's suffering, for the danger she had faced, for the trauma she had endured. He carried the weight of his guilt heavily, his self-reproach a constant burden. He became withdrawn, distant, his old habits of silence and solitude resurfacing. He immersed himself in his duties, working tirelessly to manage the estate, to oversee the rebuilding efforts, to ensure the safety and well-being of his people. He avoided Isabel, not out of a lack of love, but out of a sense of shame, of unworthiness. Isabel recognized his struggles, his pain, his self-imposed isolation. She knew that she had to reach him, to break through his walls, to remind him of their love, of their connection, of their shared future. She tried to talk to him, to reason with him, to reassure him. But he remained distant, his defenses impenetrable. He pushed her away, gently but firmly, his silence a barrier between them. Isabel realized that words were not enough. She needed to show him, to demonstrate her love, her forgiveness, her unwavering commitment to their marriage. She needed to besiege his heart. She began a campaign of small gestures, of subtle acts of love and affection. She left him small gifts, notes of encouragement, tokens of her appreciation. She prepared his favorite meals. She tended to his needs. She anticipated his desires. She filled their chambers with flowers, with light, with warmth. She also sought him out, joining him in his work, accompanying him on his rides, sharing his meals, his silences, his moments of solitude. She did not press him to talk, to open up, to share his feelings. She simply was there, a constant presence, a reassuring warmth, a silent testament to her love. Slowly, gradually, Tristan began to respond. He noticed her efforts, her gestures, her unwavering support. He felt her love, her patience, her understanding. He saw the forgiveness in her eyes, the unwavering commitment in her expression. He began to thaw, the ice around his heart melting, his defenses crumbling. He started to talk, to share his feelings, to express his fears, his guilt, his self-reproach. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire, Tristan finally broke down. He wept, his tears flowing freely, his body shaking with the force of his emotions. "I almost lost you, Isabel," he sobbed. "I couldn't protect you. I failed you." Isabel held him close, her arms embracing him, her heart aching for his pain. "You did not fail me, Tristan," she said softly. "You saved me. You were there for me. You brought me back." "But Ashworth," he began. "Ashworth is gone," Isabel interrupted. "He cannot hurt us anymore. We are safe. We are together. That is all that matters." They talked for hours, sharing their fears, their hopes, their dreams. They reaffirmed their love, their commitment, their unwavering bond. They acknowledged the pain of the past, but they also embraced the promise of the future. Tristan finally understood that Isabel did not blame him, that she loved him unconditionally, that she was his partner, his equal, his soulmate. He realized that he had been punishing himself, that he had been allowing his guilt to consume him, that he had been pushing away the one person who could truly heal him. The siege of hearts was over. Isabel had broken through Tristan's defenses, not with force, but with love, with patience, with unwavering commitment. She had conquered his heart, not with weapons, but with kindness, with understanding, with forgiveness. Their love, tested by fire, tempered by adversity, had emerged stronger, more resilient, more enduring. They had weathered the storm, survived the siege, and emerged victorious, their bond unbreakable, their future secure. The siege, a silent battle fought with tenderness and unwavering devotion, had ultimately brought them closer than ever before. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. With Ashworth gone and the threat to Ravenska neutralized, a new era dawned. An era of peace, of rebuilding, of healing. But it was also an era of reckoning, of facing the consequences of past actions, of making amends, of forging a new path forward. For Tristan and Isabel, this meant not only rebuilding their lives together, but also redefining their roles as Lord and Lady of Ravenska. They had proven themselves to be more than just figureheads, more than just symbols of power and authority. They had become true leaders, partners in governance, champions of their people. They worked together, side by side, to address the needs of their community. They oversaw the reconstruction of Oakhaven, providing resources, support, and comfort to the villagers who had suffered so much. They implemented new policies to strengthen Ravenska's defenses to ensure the safety and security of their lands. They also fostered trade, encouraged agriculture, and promoted education, creating a more prosperous and vibrant society. Isabel, in particular, took on a more prominent role in the governance of Ravenska. She used her intelligence, her compassion, her diplomatic skills to mediate disputes, to resolve conflicts, to build bridges between different factions. She became a trusted advisor to Tristan, a valued counselor to the people, a powerful advocate for justice and fairness. She also championed the cause of women, empowering them to take on more active roles in society, to pursue education, to develop their skills, to contribute their talents to the community. She established a school for girls, a haven for abused women, a network of support for widows and orphans. She became a symbol of hope, of change, of a new era where women were not just seen as wives and mothers, but as individuals with their own rights, their own aspirations, their own potential. Tristan, initially hesitant about Isabel's expanding role, came to recognize her strength, her wisdom, her unwavering commitment to the well-being of their people. He saw how she inspired others, how she empowered those around her, how she brought a new perspective to the challenges they faced. He learned to trust her judgment, to rely on her advice, to value her partnership. Their love, tempered by adversity, had blossomed into a deep and abiding respect, a mutual admiration, a shared vision for the future. They were no longer just husband and wife, lord and lady. They were partners, equals, soulmates, bound together by a love that had survived the trials of war, of betrayal, of near death. One spring morning, almost a year after the poisoning, Isabel discovered she was with child. The news brought a wave of joy, of hope, of renewal to Ravenska. It was a symbol of their love, of their resilience, of their future together. It was a promise of a new generation, a new beginning, a new legacy. Tristan was overjoyed, his heart filled with a love so profound it brought tears to his eyes. He had never thought he would have another chance at fatherhood, another chance at happiness. He had believed that his heart was frozen, incapable of feeling such joy, such hope, such love. But Isabel had thawed his heart, had brought him back to life, had given him a future he had never dared to dream of. As Isabel's pregnancy progressed, the people of Ravenska celebrated, their hearts filled with anticipation, with hope, with love for their lord and lady, for the future heir to their lands. The birth of their child, a healthy son they named Edmund, after Isabel's father, was a moment of profound joy, of celebration, of unity. It was a symbol of the enduring strength of Ravenska, of the resilience of its people, of the power of love to overcome even the darkest of shadows. The reckoning of love and duty had been completed. Tristan and Isabel had faced their challenges, overcome their obstacles, and emerged victorious. They had built a strong and prosperous society, a loving and supportive family, a legacy that would endure for generations to come. Their love story, born in the midst of conflict and betrayal, had blossomed into a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, the resilience of the human heart, the transformative power of love. It was the perfect blending of purpose and affection. The future, once so uncertain, stretched before them, filled with possibility and promise. Epilogue. Years passed, marked by the gentle rhythm of life in Ravenska. Edmund grew, a strong and spirited boy, inheriting his father's courage and his mother's intelligence. He was the pride of Ravenska, the symbol of its future, the embodiment of his parents' love. 2 more children followed, a daughter named Lyra, in honor of Tristan's first wife, and another son, named Gareth, in memory of the brave knight who had fallen defending their lands. Tristan and Isabel ruled Ravenska wisely and justly, their partnership a model of governance, their love a beacon of hope. They had learned from the past, from the mistakes of others, from the trials they had endured. They had built a society based on fairness, on compassion, on respect for all. The memory of Ashworth and his treachery faded, becoming a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of ambition, of hatred, of betrayal. The scars of the past remained, but they were no longer wounds, but reminders of the strength they had found in each other, of the love that had sustained them, of the resilience that had allowed them to overcome. Ravenska flourished, its lands prosperous, its people content, its future secure. The castle, once a symbol of coldness and isolation, became a place of warmth, of community, of love. The whispers in the north wind were no longer of curses and betrayals, but of hope, of prosperity, of a bright future. Isabel, as she grew older, never lost her spirit, her intelligence, her compassion. She remained a force for good, a champion of the weak, a voice for the voiceless. She continued to advise Tristan, to support him, to share the burdens of leadership. She was his partner, his equal, his soulmate, his love. Tristan, softened by time and love, shed the last vestiges of the ice wolf. He became known not for his coldness, but for his wisdom, his justice, his unwavering commitment to his people. He was a beloved lord, a respected leader, a devoted husband and father. He had found peace, happiness, and a love that had exceeded his wildest dreams. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the snow-capped mountains, Tristan and Isabel stood on the battlements, the same battlements where they had shared their first kiss, the same battlements where they had faced their greatest challenges. They were older now, their faces lined with the marks of time, their hair streaked with silver, but their love remained as strong, as vibrant, as enduring as ever. Tristan reached out, his hand taking Isabel's. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a love that had only deepened with time, a love that had weathered every storm, a love that had triumphed over every obstacle. "We did it, Isabel," he said, his voice soft, his words filled with gratitude and love. "We built a good life, a good home." Isabel smiled, her eyes sparkling with tears of joy. "Yes, my love," she replied. "We did." Together. They stood there, hand in hand, watching the sun set, their silhouettes outlined against the fiery sky. They were surrounded by the beauty of Ravenska, by the legacy they had created, by the love that had bound them together for a lifetime. The wind whispered through the battlements, carrying with it the echoes of the past, the memories of their struggles, the triumphs of their love. But it also carried the promise of the future, the hope of generations to come, the enduring legacy of the Winter Lord and his courageous bride. Their tale, a testament to the power of love, loyalty, and resilience, would be told and retold, a legend whispered in the halls of Ravenska for centuries to come. The ending was a new beginning, and a well-deserved one. The end.